Hi everyone, and welcome to my Procreate demo for the piece I call SketchBLEAARRGH. So this is SketchBot. He's a creation of Steve Tolkowski, who you can see here. That's his website, sketchbot.tv. He asked me if I would do my own take on his awesome character SketchBot, and I said, absolutely, that sounds like a blast. So that's what this is. I started this, I did a few different sketches that sort of went in different directions, which I didn't include in the video. They didn't get very far. They're honestly nothing worth looking at. I just thought they were not that great. So instead what I did was I started over and I decided to pull from one of my more, I guess, unknown inspirations, in the sense that a lot of people don't necessarily look at him and think that he might be an inspiration of mine, but that's Todd Shore. I went to an art exhibit years ago. I was on an art team, and the lead concept artist, Jim Pearson, took us all there to this art exhibit for Todd Shore, and I was immediately inspired, but at the time I didn't even remotely have the skills to try and do any of the things that he does. So this was sort of my first try to very consciously just say, I'm gonna totally go like American Surrealist, like Todd Shore, and do something like that. So even though his work influences a lot of things that I do, this is the first time that I really went after something like that. So I took SketchBot and I started by just sort of reinterpreting him a lot. He normally carries a pencil, so I wanted to make sure the pencil was in there. One of his arms is slightly bigger than the other, so I wanted to really exaggerate that. He doesn't have a mouth, but I just really like drawing mouths, and I thought it would add more visual interest to my particular piece, so I wanted to make sure that I got a mouth in there. And a lot of the other stuff is really just trying to get as much action and as many materials and things like that on the canvas as possible, so that I could try to really do something fun with them when I would go to render them. So the tears are there, the veins in the eyeball are there, the metallic of his arms is there, and all of that really is just to make sure that I was trying to get a variety of materials into the scene. So his arm is sort of zigzagging back and forth in the distance like it's crazy long and it's sort of gone out of control. I thought it'd be fun to give him a pair of loafers, so I gave him a pair of loafers. And then because he's got that mouth, his SketchBot symbol, chest plate, is flying off of his face. So I wanted to make sure that was in there. So I wanted to try and honor as many of the elements that Steve had put into SketchBot, but then bring a lot of sort of wacky new things that you might not even necessarily recognize as SketchBot, except for the fact that you're probably looking at it because you're aware of SketchBot and you wanted to see this version of it. So now, as you can see, I did several versions of the lines on this one. I did like a super rough, and then a rough, and then a tighter line, and even this tighter line is really messy. Like, I would never go take this and actually leave the lines into the piece in order to finish it, because it's really just there to make sure that I have the highest contrast example that I can then paint under. So that way, you know, when you're lowering the opacity and everything, you don't have white or a lot of grays or something like that that are being lowered in opacity with the black of the lines, that then can just sort of muddle that image when you're really trying to get it clear and sharp as a reference point for your painting. So now I'm just going in and making sure, like, see, I'm putting in that sort of comic book metal in there. That's really just to sort of mentally remind myself when I go back in to do it later that that's going to be metal. Because when you go to render it, something that symbolic isn't really going to work out. It's just so I can remember that's what that is. Now, I knew that layer management was going to be a problem. We all know that Procreate has a limit on layers based on your canvas size, and this is an 8-inch by 12-inch canvas at 300 dpi. So here I transition to a new document, and I import in the lines and start doing my flats. Throughout the process of this, I think I had to duplicate the overall canvas, you know, like the actual file in Procreate, I think 4 times, so that'd be 5 files. Because I would merge things down in order to try and get more layers freed up. So that means I would duplicate the file, go back in, figure out the things that I thought were more or less done, and merge those layers, and then, you know, add in the layers that I needed to add in. One of the cool things about Procreate's new update having folders that you can put things into is that you can very easily duplicate a folder if you want to, say, take a bunch of shapes and flatten them into a selection. So you can take like a whole folder and duplicate it and flatten it, and then use that as your selection. The only problem is, of course, is that if you have, let's say, a canvas that's limited to 50 layers and you happen to have a 26 layer folder, which I know is kind of crazy, but let's just say you have that. If you go to duplicate that folder, you won't be able to. So luckily you can maybe take a couple things out of it and then duplicate it and then stick them back in. But that's a lot of management problems, which kind of sucks. If anybody out there knows of a way that you can take an existing folder and merge it into a new layer, which is something that you can do in Photoshop by holding Alt when you go to merge it, that would be a lifesaver. So that's my call to you guys, to try and show me something, as you guys do quite often, which is great. Is there something like that? Because I really desperately need that. So now this is my layer stack after I've done the flats. All of those individual layers have just whatever layer name that they were assigned. Because since I'm on an iPad not having a keyboard, renaming layers is a little bit tedious, but renaming folders is great. So each one of those folders has the name of the thing that's been flatted. So it's like pencil or main body or eye or something like that. So now we're going into the rendering process. Throughout the entirety of this piece, well, that's a lie. I won't say the entirety. Let's say 90% of it, I'm using the same old paintbrush that I always use, which is the one that's in the painting section. It's the round brush. That's what it's called. That's what I use throughout a majority of this. Then there are certain areas, like say trying to get the softness of the eye. I will use the softer airbrush. But like always, I use a soft airbrush eraser so that I can maybe paint in a little bit too hard with the round brush, and then I can knock it back a little bit with the softer eraser. So the big thing here, I didn't really directly stare at any Todd Shore stuff when I was rendering this. A lot of the general look and feel of his I definitely have internalized, and then I might have checked it a couple times just to see how he might handle a material here or there. One of the biggest things that I just wanted to make sure that I was doing when I was painting this was that I was honoring the light source as much as possible, and then I was also honoring the bounce light that was coming off of all of the individual objects. So you'll see as the thing goes on, I'm trying to make sure that the yellow from the pencil actually casts some yellow onto the arm, or the bright orange from or better yet, the purple from the background is bouncing off of the metal that's all over the place. So I was just trying to really make sure that I was keeping an eye on my materials. One of the things that I think that Todd Shore does the best is he really honors his materials and makes everything feel very tangible, and that's just what I push for the most here. Okay, so now here I am just finishing up the last touches on his main orange body, and then we'll be moving on to the eye. So here's where I said I start with a softer brush. I usually always do that when I'm painting an eye. It's really just a personal preference. I know that I'm going to want to capture those soft shapes, so instead of going in hard and then erasing it, I just know what I'm gonna need to do that anyways. If you're curious about how I handled the veins on the eye, I actually did it by drawing them in really thin with one of the ink brushes. It doesn't really matter which one, just whatever one does a thin, sharp line for you. And then I duplicated it and then blurred the duplication, then lowered both of the opacities on both of those layers just enough so that it felt right. And then I went back in with a layer set to add and put in a bunch of little highlights on it just to try and give it that bumpy juiciness that's really gross on veins. You might not be able to tell it so well here because of the resolution, but when I post the picture up on DeviantArt, hopefully it'll be a high enough res that you'll be able to see it. So yeah, then we finish off the rest of that eye, and now we're going in and doing those tears, which are just always really fun to do. It essentially can be accomplished with just two layers, and then, two layers is the main body of it. But you can see then I wanted to make sure to go in and get the orange bloom, or not bloom, but bounce off of his body onto that. So while the pencil's being colored, because that's pretty simple, I'll further explain the tiers. Basically, you take that big main shape that you had, and then you duplicate that main shape, and then you lower the opacity of the original one, and then you just use a soft eraser and erase away on the second layer. So what you end up doing is you end up creating a halo of all that light that's sort of defining the outer edges of the tier, but then you still have a little bit of a backing to it, so you can then adjust both of those values in terms of opacity and see how you get your balance there. Then I just went in with a white brush set to add to get that like hot highlight on top of it. Then the bloom and all that, I mean, that's all stuff that you'll have to mess around with and try to figure out how you're going to do it exactly. If it were different colored liquid, you try different colors, you know, all of that kind of stuff. So now on the pencil, the main thing that I wanted to focus on with the pencil was just getting some of that dimensionality and making sure I'm capturing the bounce light. As you can see, there's purple bounce light on the underside of it, and then making sure like the shadow from the eye is casting over properly and all of that. Now you can see there on the metal, I just really quickly did some duplication, kept it pretty fast, and I think it came out all right, so I think it was relatively successful. And then those little, you know, holes that are punched into the metal, had to do that real quick. I actually looked up a pencil because I don't have a physical pencil in my house. Isn't that kind of ridiculous? And I had to look one up to remember what that patterning sort of looked like. And then there's an eraser with just a slight divot taken out of it. I think I mentioned previously in, I can't remember which video it was, but I was talking about damage and adding damage to things, and even something like this, adding a little bit of damage, like how there's nicks in the pencil, and there's that damage in the eraser there. It adds to the realism of something, even something as insane looking as this. It adds to the realism to have things have slight damages in it. So now I've moved on to the mouth. We're just going to, this is pretty standard if you've seen some of my past pieces. I'm just going in, I'm going to paint the teeth, then I'm going to paint the gums, and the inside of the mouth on this guy is actually pretty simple because I didn't want to clutter it any further. So I'm just going in layer by layer, then I'm making sure I'm honoring all of the shadows correctly. Then when the whole thing wraps up, I'll just add some darkening on the sides of it, basically, where it's going into his mouth and then where it's curving away into the distance. And all of that is just to make sure that the whole thing, that the depth is really pushed on that mouth. There you can see there, it's darker now. So now we're going to work on the badge here. It was all just a bunch of tricks, and I'm sorry that that went by so quick. I recommend you go back and re-watch it. I'm not going to duplicate the footage right now, but it's basically just me taking the flats that I already made and doing a bunch of duplications and recolors and then scooting them in order to get that depth on there. Now we're on the metal. The way that I decided to do the metal on this one was to essentially have your base flat and then a layer that's establishing the main form, and then another layer that's establishing the hard shine, and then a layer that's establishing the darkest side of it. And then I'll go back in and make sure that I've got certain bounces coming off of different surfaces. I wanted it to be evocative of metal, not be super 100% accurate. I just wanted it to really feel like metal. I feel like that is, maybe that's a shortchanging the American Surrealist inspiration that I was going with, but I feel like that was the more important aspect, was making it feel metally. You know, it's like in a lot of that stuff you'll see almost like hot rod chrome and everything, as opposed to super reflective, accurate metal. That's really what I was going for. You'll see as I'm working on this closer arm now, you'll see that smaller arm, the layers turning on and off. Oh yeah, and then I used one of the random grunge brushes just to put some grunge into the metal. So now I'm doing the back arm. Now, in order for me to preempt my layer management, that little tiny arm and then that big arm really in the front are all part of the same layer stack. That was just my way of trying to manage that early. And then that back leg and the big arm that's behind him are on their own layer stack, and then on top of that would then be the other leg. Eventually we'll get to it. So all of this was to try and maintain separation so that I could really control what I was doing, but at the same time trying to minimize it, because if I had unlimited layers, obviously that little arm would have its own layer stack, the big arm would have its own layer stack, the big back arm, same thing. So I was just trying to make sure that I was being smart about it up front, and then I knew I was going to still run into problems, but I wanted to head them off for as long as possible, because painting in Procreate is always a blast until you start getting into the layer management aspects, and then it's like every time you create a new layer, it's like you're rolling the dice, like, oh shit, am I at my layer max? And then you find out you are, and then you're like, oh, and you have to figure out how you're going to get around it. So now here, this is actually pretty quick and speed painty the way I do these shoes, but because they're so small and because they're going to get knocked back quite a bit, and they also have things like the sole and the laces to really define themselves, I didn't really have to go that far with making these look like the best rendered shoes on the planet. You can see there when it gets small again, like they look like shoes. At least I hope they look like shoes. But so those are probably the least detailed things throughout the entire piece. So now I just pull out to quickly show the arms in the background. They don't get as much detail as the rest of the metal because I didn't want them to compete with the metal in the front, and then they get blurred a little bit to knock them back. Then I went in and threw in some spit after the fact because I knew I really wanted to have spit in his mouth, but I wanted to save it because I didn't want that to be taking up layers when I knew I could just throw it on real quick at the end. At one point too, you'll notice that I go into sort of feedback mode, which is I reached out to a couple friends and said, hey, what do you think of it? Actually, one friend, to be honest. It was one dude I sent this to. I was like, hey, what do you think? Because he knew Steve, and I wanted to see if he thought Steve would like this before I sent it to him. And he just gave me a little bit of feedback, so I put some more detail into the shoes and tweaked those, and then that little piece of pencil right by his mouth, you'll see I fix that, I move it, so there we go. So it's a little less conflicting with everything that's going on. That was all thanks to Jeremy Dale, so thanks, Jeremy. And that's the final piece. So here you can see the lines. This was the crude lines that I used to base the whole piece on. And then there's the final render. So there's a much more detailed piece than what I've been doing lately, and it was really fun. You're probably going to see a lot more of these, so I hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching, and if you did like it, please hit that like button and consider subscribing. And if you're looking for me on the internet, these are the places where you can find me.